I want to talk about what has remained the same and what has changed in the three hidden histories that I'm dealing with. Let me start with England. If you look at England now, or shall we say a few years ago, because things are very confused at the moment, say in the later 20th century when I was still teaching, then if you look at each part of English culture and society, and it's better to go back there because there's been a lot of immigration now, and so we'll go back to, shall we say, 1980, roughly, and you look at various features and ask whether they were suddenly transformed and invented as the myths would have it in the 16th and 17th century, 18th century, the Great Transformation, the watershed, and so on. Let's go through them. Firstly, we can look at language. Well, that's an easy one. We speak a variant of Anglo-Saxon, which goes back to the Anglo-Saxon invasions in the 5th, 6th centuries. Obviously, it's been modified through time. There's quite a lot of Anglo-Norman French, and then bits and pieces of other languages have dropped in. But the grammatical structure and the vocabulary and the syntax is still, 80-90% Anglo-Saxon. So that wasn't invented in the 15th, 16th century. The next thing to look at, which is quite simple, is the legal system. The legal system, as Maitland pointed out at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was true later too, the legal system of England was fully formed and shaped by the end of the 12th century. And many elements of it went back way before that, before the Norman invasions. So in the fundamentals of the common law, in the fundamentals of the procedures, the punishments, and the elements of the courts, it goes back, in essence, again to the Anglo-Saxons, and then was strengthened and modified by the Normans and Angevins, of course. But it's a very old system, and certainly by 13th, 14th century, English law is formed as it continued more or less up to the present. The next thing one could look at is the educational system. I was surprised to discover that the oldest continuous institution in England is the boys' boarding school. The first one was made at the end of the 6th century as a school attached to Canterbury Cathedral to teach children and to prepare them for the choir. And that institution of the boys' boarding school is flourishing right through the Middle Ages. Famous foundations like Winchester and Eton and others go back to the 15th century, the middle of the 15th century, and there are other schools before that. So the elite education and also the grammar schools go back to the 15th, 16th century. So there's no great educational shift in the 16th, 17th centuries. Another element is power, the system of government. Now, I was taught, and everyone is taught, that if you want to understand modern British politics, you have to go back right to the beginnings. You have to go back to Magna Carta in 1215, but you have to go back before that to the Witan and organisation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, King Alfred and so on, because they are very ancient. Again, they, of course, have been modified through time, but the idea of the crown or the king being under the law and not an absolute dictator. The idea of trial by juries, including the House of Lords, trying other House of Lords people. The idea of a balance between different parts of the political body, giving power to the towns and the tradesmen and merchants as well as the landholders. The idea of having discussions and arguments and debates, and gradually the idea of voting for people. All of the elements of that were there in the later Middle Ages. Very little was shifted. I remember a talk given by my tutor, James Campbell, analysing the work of Geoffrey Elton, who tried to suggest that there was a revolution in government in the Tudor period, and James showed that almost everything that Elton was saying was new was old. So basically our political system, obviously universal participatory democracy and so on, are very new, but most of the structural features go back well before the 16th century. Then in another area you can look at society, and there are various features of that. One is the family system. Well, if you look at the English family system, it's hardly changed since the Anglo-Saxon period. There are a few new names: oncle, tante, uncle, aunt, nephews, nieces. So there's a little change in terminology, and there are one or two features of a small kind that have been changed. But basically, we have a very old system which isolates out the central nuclear family, the man, the woman, and the children, from wider rings of relatives, and we consider that we are related through our mothers and our fathers, and that inheritance goes to both boys and girls. All those three elements, descent, inheritance, and terminology, are basically Anglo-Saxon with some modifications later, and nothing was changed dramatically at all in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. In another aspect, which is social structure, in other words, how the hierarchy of power is distributed, many societies have a very strong distinction between the different orders. By orders I mean the nobles, the clergy, the townsman, and the peasant, a fourfold structure which you find in most civilizations, certainly from India to the West, and it often consolidates into a caste system, as in India. England has never had a caste system. There was a little bit of slavery during the Anglo-Saxon and just after during the Normans, but then that disappeared. So it's been neither a caste nor a slave society, and it has been one which is highly stratified in the sense that if you have property and if you have other means of displaying your wealth, then you are treated as someone who is socially higher up in the gentry families, the English gentlemen, the yeomen, and so on. So there is a lot of stratification, and there always has been. The long poem by Chaucer, Pilgrims going to Canterbury, Canterbury Tales, can be seen in many ways, if you look at it from that way, as a portrait of English snobbery and social differentiation. And it was all there in the middle of the 14th century, as it had been earlier. There's no status distinctions in law between the different social orders, which was the message which Bracton in the beginning of the 13th century and later political and legal treatises showed. It's a very mixed up, people can move up and down. The one real criterion is wealth. And once you have wealth in various forms, and then you can educate your children through the elite system, then you can move up and down. So it's a very highly mobile social system of accumulation and going up and down the social structure. And that, in essence, which is what we see nowadays, is what was present in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries and before. And the other aspect of social mobility, which was present also, was geographical mobility. It was a very strong part of the myth that was constructed in the middle of the 20th century, that people were socially immobile, that they lived in a village, they were born in a village, they married, they died there. People were restricted in their horizons. They were living in peasant villages, in other words, as was imagined for India or China. That is not the case. Our studies of an English village and other studies show that people moved around constantly. They were born in one place, left home quite early often, went off to another place, moved on after an apprenticeship or servanthood to another place and married, moved again. Most people would move 3 or 4 or 5 times, many into bigger towns and cities, and then out into the countryside again. So it's constant travelling, which you can see again in Chaucer. Another feature of the social structure is the singling out of the individual. By that I mean, in most societies, and that includes China, India, and many other civilizations, the important feature of the social structure is the group. The group, the family, the village, is the all-important element, and individuals are subservient to that group. The group comes first, the individual comes later. The individual does not have private, separate rights, duties, property, etc., away from membership of a group. So that is group-based societies, and that's the normal run of things. Whereas in England, from the descriptions by Maitland and others of Anglo-Saxon social structure, the individual came first. The individual was free to go off, to own property, to get married, except maybe among the very rich, who they wanted to marry, to do the job they wanted to do, to keep their earnings from that. So the individual came first, and the individual had within their being the whole of the society. They could worship as they wished, they could vote as they wished later. So they were autonomous political, social, religious, economic actors. And the group is built up by a set of contractual, associational relationships, so that the famous movement that Sir Henry Maine talks about, of the movement of contract to status, had already occurred in Anglo-Saxon England. And that's one of the reasons why, as Maitland again points out, there are no communities in Anglo-Saxon England onwards, in the sense of Tony's use of the word community, meaning a group of people who are united by blood, by place, and by self-ascription, that we are the members of this place by name. There's nothing like that. English parishes, towns, have been places through which people pass, spend time, they form into clubs, they form into associations, but they don't form ever. Community with a large C is absent. So the social structure is very old and rather unusual. Moving on to the economy, one of the great shocks in my book on individualism was that I'd assumed, as had been taught to me, that private property, individual property, was something that emerged with the decline and collapse of feudal peasant societies in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in England. But the work we did on manorial records and other records going back to the 13th century in England showed that this was not the case. The Anglo-Saxons had invented wills so that a person at their death could leave their property to whom they liked, and private property was protected. The central feature of capitalism, as John Locke and Karl Marx and others pointed out, which is private property, was there well before the 15th century. And the documents make no sense if you don't realize that. So private property was there. I'd also assumed that, as I was taught, that the idea of a market economy, a place where money was very important, and you can exchange and buy what you liked, was something which developed in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. This is not the case. If you look at the great medieval fairs and markets, at the shops, at the economic documents from as early as they exist in England, that's back to the 12th century in some detail, and well before that, you can see that money, markets, trading, doing business was absolutely innate and widespread. It's no coincidence that England had the finest currency, silver coinage, in Europe in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, before the Normans came. So money and money values, the idea that you can exchange almost anything for money, was present. So there was no capitalist revolution of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. The forms of production, the division of labour, the production by hand loom, by weavers, the forms of agricultural production using a lot of non-human labour, watermills, windmills, animal power, was very soon developed. And so I was not surprised, although I should have been, and perhaps I was when I first saw it, by coming across an article by someone called Keras Wilson, which was called The First Industrial Revolution. And I thought it would be about Manchester or something in the 19th century, but 18th century, but it was actually about the 13th century and the woolen mills on the streams and rivers of England. So England was industrial to a certain extent, and certainly highly productive and efficient in both its agriculture and in its manufacturing, which is why things like the greatest, largest cathedrals in the world could be built. You can't build such things without a great deal of distributed wealth and rents and so on. So certainly my college, King's College, which has very early court rolls, shows the properties of the college and how the rents and marketing was done. So the economy is very old and disembedded. Another feature is belief. Again, it was easy to assume that until basically Catholicism, with its rituals and magic and so on, was driven out by Henry VIII, then you had an ancient Christian civilization where everything was interfused and the world was filled with spirits, and it was very similar in many ways to most societies. And then you had the Protestant Reformation and things became modern. If you look again at the English documents for the Middle Ages, even if you look back to the Anglo-Saxons, you see that although you couldn't call them Protestant, the belief in individual religious autonomy of individuals, the idea that the world was to a certain extent disenchanted. You had magic wells, of course, and you had certain elements of folklore which seemed to be of that kind of magical pre-Reformation world. But the more you look into it, the more continuity you see. And certainly there was no huge shift in the 15th, 16th centuries from a magical worldview to a modern disenchanted worldview, even though when I was writing my doctorate on witchcraft, that was the framework within which I worked, but I now see it was wrong. Another element is art and aesthetics. The English have not been particularly noted for their arts, their plastic arts and their pictorial arts. There are certain times, though, when they have had a very distinctive art tradition, and one of them is the 14th, 15th century English perpendicular architecture, of which my college at King's, Cambridge, is a famous example. And so there are periods, and Pevsner, in his little book, The Englishness of English Art, or maybe it's an article, goes into certain features which he realizes, because he's done a great study of English churches and houses, is very distinctive and goes back in the architecture well before the 16th, 17th century. There is no revolution in architecture in the 16th and 17th century. Changes in style, of course, influences of elsewhere. And likewise in music, if you listen to the plain song, if you listen to the medieval carols being sung, it's very different as music develops through to modern orchestral music, of course. But many of the elements are continuous, and there is no moment at which you can suddenly say they switched from a different tonal system or a different way of thinking about music. And this is even more obviously the case with the forms of art which the English did excel at. One of these was poetry, and if you look at poetry, the great flourishing of English poetry in the 16th century with Shakespeare and through the metaphysicals and so on, is a huge leap. But it's not radically different from the poetry of the medieval poets, from Chaucer back and forth, and even back to Anglo-Saxon poetry. Many of the deeper conventions and grammar of the poetry, and certainly the subject matter, which is usually love in one form or another, or nature, or wistfulness, that continues through, so that it's a continuous poetic tradition. And although novels are formally invented for the first time, and one of the great traditions of England from the later 17th, early 18th century, novels in the sense of stories of people's lives which are semi-fictionalized go back through stories of Robin Hood or Dick Whittington or other legendary heroes, back and back to the Anglo-Saxon stories of Hereward the Wake and so on. So novel writing of a certain kind, and certainly essay writing, at which the English are also very good, are old traditions, as are letter writing, very fine collections of letters from the 15th century onwards, and even autobiographical writing of various kinds. So, putting it all together, I define modernity as the separation between four great forces and institutions in our lives: society, economy, power and politics, and religion and ideology. And as those become split apart, you get autonomous regions. This is a fictional device for allowing you freedom in each of them so that you can pursue various goals without finding that your social or economic goals are being dominated by your religion or politics. That is what I think of as modernity. And I think that in using that definition, England is a modern society as far back as I can see in the records. In the origins of English individualism, I pushed it back to 1200. But then when I wrote The Invention of the Modern World, much later, particularly in the last chapter, I pushed it back to the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and I think that is roughly the case. None of this is to say that things don't change and evolve and change, but it's looking at it another way. If you looked at a tree and you said that this is a small beech or oak tree with only a few branches and some leaves here, and then 50 years later it's a large oak tree with many more branches and the trunk's wider and the roots deeper and so on and so on. But it's the same tree. It's put out new branches and twigs and leaves, but the shape, the organic shape, is roughly the same. It doesn't change from an oak to an ash. And I think that organic metaphor fits very well with what I've studied in English history and what I've learned from some years of working on English documents and comparing England to other places. It's very odd, and it's ancient, though in terms of what I'll talk about with China, it's all quite modern or recent. Thank you.